This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. After last week's episode about the alleged possession of Sumitra Singh by the unsettled spirit of the murdered Shiva Tripathi, I received a higher than usual amount of comments and inquiries about my thoughts on the case. You know, stuff like, well, what do you think now, big shot? Because yes, I'm a highly skeptical, interested party when it comes to unexplained events. My general feeling is that these events are explainable, highly unusual, often terrifying, but explainable. I mean, look, I told the story of the possession case in Gary, Indiana, where medical staff witnessed a little kid walk up a wall backwards, and they went on the record. That was a first for me. And reading up on the Shiva Tripathi case was crazy interesting, as one paper in particular, written by academics, concluded that knowledge had been obtained paranormally. Concluded. So, yeah, strange times. There were also comments thanking me for showcasing a possession case that didn't bash Catholicism. Okay, I get it. And yes, I admit my knowledge of possession cases were almost exclusively of the Catholic flavor, with demons from hell taking over an innocent victim for nefarious purposes. In my defense, those cases are fun to research. They're fun to write about. They're dramatic and scary, and often end with the God of Abraham victorious and those pesky demons tricked or forced out of their unwilling hosts. But these other types of possession cases are starting to win me over. Shiva Tripathi had some more living to do and found a way to take over the body of Sumitra and implicate her sister-in-law for murder while she was at it. So I did a little digging and found a few more that deserve a closer look. Welcome back to The Devil Within. You're listening to The Mysterious Death of Pepe Veraldi. In 1936, Italy was basically a police state. 14 years into the reign of the fascist Mussolini, who spent his early years as prime minister dismantling any governmental checks that would prevent him from establishing a totalitarian state. With that accomplished, he installed himself as supreme leader, aligned himself with Hitler, and awaited the inevitability of World War II. As is always the case with such men, his time ended violently, with a public execution, and Italy returned to being a democratic republic. But those years in between the two great wars, despite all the turmoil and uncertainty, people still had to live their lives, raise their families, go to work, fall in love. Such was the case with the young Italian man from Catanzaro named Giuseppe Veraldi, Pepe to his friends. Pepe was a young man of 25, too young to have been scarred by the horrors of the First World War, and too hopeful of his future to be worried about the second, which seemed just around the corner. He had met, courted, and fallen in love with a local girl, and, as young lovers do, they had already begun planning their lives together. So it came as a terrible shock when the mangled body of Pepe Veraldi was found among the rocks beside a bridge on February 13th, 1936. And here is where the internet can trick you. I had this whole introduction planned out that chronicled the life and work of Italian civil engineer Riccardo Morandi. The reason I was going to do this is because there are several accounts of Pepe's death that have his cause of death to be jumping from the Morandi Bridge in Catanzaro. The only problem with that is Morandi didn't start building bridges until the 1950s. I think I found the right bridge, but more on that in a minute. First, a little about Catanzaro, Italy. Catanzaro is the capital of the province of Catanzaro, as well as the capital city of the southern Italian region of Calabria. Where's Calabria? Well, if Italy's a boot, Calabria is the toe. All of Italy is obviously a peninsula, but it gets pretty narrow by the toe, and because of this, Catanzaro is known as the City of the Two Seas. The city itself sits on the Ionian Sea, and just across the isthmus to the west is the Tyrrhenian Sea. The origin of the city can be traced back to an ancient Greek colony, and has at various times over the centuries been under Roman, Norman, and Saracen control, and then Greek again sometime in there. Things settled down by the 15th century as large-scale silk production took over Catanzaro, and the famed silk weavers of the region became famous across Europe. But about that bridge. As stated, the Morandi Bridge wasn't built in Catanzaro until 1963-ish. So what bridge did Pepe Veraldi fall from? I think it was probably the Fiumarella, an aqueduct and railway bridge that was built in the early 1930s in Catanzaro. Pedestrians used the bridge often, and at its highest point, it was almost 100 feet above the rocky terrain below. There was actually a tragic train derailment there in 1961 that took the lives of 71 passengers. But on this day in 1936, despite being newly in love with his whole life ahead of him, the police concluded that young Pepe Veraldi committed suicide by jumping off that bridge and being dashed on the rocks below. Despite near hysterical objections from Pepe's family and even an investigation spearheaded by the local press, the case was considered settled. As the years passed and the gathering storm of World War II became the main topic of conversation locally and across Europe, the case of Pepe Veraldi faded from memory. Then, one chilly afternoon in January of 1939, 3 years later, a local teenager named Maria Tallarico was walking home across the railway bridge when she claims she reached the spot where Pepe Veraldi supposedly leapt to his death. She didn't know how she knew this, but she was convinced of the actual spot on the bridge. She was drawn to it. Then she became lightheaded and feared she might pass out. Well, it would seem she did pass out. In fact, faint, because she was found sometime later by other pedestrians on the bridge, and the police were notified. Maria was identified and brought home, still unconscious, where she then slept for several hours before being examined by a local doctor. After a thorough examination, nothing could be found wrong with young Maria, and the incident was just considered a fainting spell for unknown reasons, and she was given a clean bill of health. But very soon things would take a dramatic turn, because Maria was no longer Maria. She suddenly spoke in a low, masculine voice and claimed that she was, in fact, Pepe Veraldi. She insisted on being called Pepe and that she needed to see Pepe's mother immediately. And while she waited, would the family mind fetching him a bottle of wine, a pack of cigarettes, and some playing cards? Seriously, Pepe was that kind of an action guy. Maria decidedly was not, but she seemed to, out of nowhere, have intimate knowledge of several different card games and was able to smoke and drink like a seasoned pro, although up to that point, she hadn't partaken in either of those vices. Maria's family was in considerable distress, understandably. Their daughter comes home unconscious after fading near the edge of a damn bridge, and when she wakes up, she claims to be a dude named Pepe, who died by jumping off that same spot 3 years earlier? Okay. At Maria/Pepe's insistence, Maria's father contacted the still grieving mother of Pepe Veraldi, and, against her better judgment, Mrs. Veraldi agreed to visit the Tallarico home and see what the hell was going on. What she would find would make matters much, much worse. Now, look, Even though the 1930s was pretty much the height of the spiritualist movement, where just about everyone on Earth had heard about the possibility of gifted people being able to communicate with the dead, still, Mrs. Veraldi was sure that this whole thing was a prank, or maybe some kind of grift aimed at capitalizing on her vulnerability and grief over the loss of her son. But on the off chance that all this communication from beyond the grave business was real, come on, who wouldn't want to talk to a lost loved one? So, when Mrs. Veraldi arrived at the Tallarico house, the first clue that this might be legit was her son's voice. She recognized Pepe's voice before she ever even set eyes on Maria. As Mrs. Veraldi made her way through the front door and into the Tallarico kitchen, she overheard Maria/Pepe say, "When is my mother getting here?" Hearing her son was like a punch in the gut. She knew he was dead, but his voice in her ears was real. And when Mrs. Veraldi actually entered the living room and saw this teenage girl speaking and sounding like her dead son, she again began to believe it was all a cruel hoax, until she saw a piece of paper on the coffee table with a street address scribbled on it. It was her address, the home in which she raised Pepe, but it wasn't what was written that convinced her that what she was experiencing was real. It was the fact that it was written in Pepe's handwriting. It was then that Maria looked up and exclaimed, "Mama!" Mrs. Veraldi resisted the embrace for a moment, but then relented. Again, on the off chance that this was real, she couldn't refuse an embrace from her deceased son. It was then that Maria/Pepe explained the reason for this extraordinary possession from beyond the grave. Pepe wanted to assure his mother that he had not committed suicide, but that he was in fact murdered. 4 men, supposed friends, had attacked Pepe, and once they saw the extent of the bruises, they decided to kill him to avoid being charged with assault. They dragged Pepe to the bridge and threw him over the side. After this incredible admission that was so important that Pepe Veraldi made the most impossible arrangements in order to have the truth be known, Maria Tallarico, apparently still possessed by Pepe, suddenly sprinted from the house in the direction of the bridge. With her family, as well as Mrs. Veraldi in pursuit, Maria/Pepe made it to the bridge and continued on to the exact spot where she had been discovered earlier, and promptly fainted again. When she awoke hours later, she had no recollection of what had happened. Now, all this may sound amazing, and you can imagine the relief and the despair that Pepe's mother must have felt. Relief that she was right about her son not killing himself, and utter despair that he was murdered and that his killers were still on the loose. You see, despite Pepe's interdimensional messenger service, he had left out some very important details. The most important being the freaking names of the bad guys. All he said was 4 men he counted as friends had turned on him, beaten him, and murdered him to cover it up. What was a mother to do? She knew the police wouldn't lift a finger if she came to them with a story so outrageous. Yeah, this teenager seems to have been possessed by my dead son for a little while and said that he was murdered. Can you look into it? You can see her point. So once again, the case of Pepe Veraldi faded from the memory of the citizens of Catanzaro, Italy. It would be another 9 years before justice would be done. On a day like any other in post-war Italy, in the spring of 1948, 12 years since the murder of her son, Mrs. Veraldi received a letter in the mail. It was addressed to her and written by a man named Luigi Marchette. She vaguely remembered the name, It was a friend of Pepe's who had left Catanzaro and fought for the Allies in the Second World War, maybe becoming a pilot. She couldn't remember exactly what, but she remembered the name. The contents of the letter, however, would change her life and finally put her on a path towards justice for her son. In the late winter back in 1936, young Luigi Marchette told his family that he was moving away. Enraged at what his beloved Italy had become under Mussolini, he was determined to find a way to combat the evil regime. Given the political climate, it would be extremely dangerous for him to leave, and there was a good chance they would never hear from him again, because if war should visit Europe for a second time, he would be there fighting for justice and freedom. Sounds nice, right? Like a good, patriotic kid following his conscience and putting his money where his mouth was. But it's also a great cover story for a kid who just committed murder. In fact, Luigi Marchette could give a shit about fascists and only wanted to save his own ass. He fled to Argentina. Why? He had just murdered his friend over a woman. When Luigi settled in Argentina, one of the first things he did was write a letter to Pepe's mother, explaining what had happened while the events were still fresh in his mind. It seems Luigi had secretly been in love with a woman from town, whose heart would be won by Pepe. Luigi hadn't told anyone of his affections, so Pepe had no idea that his friend's heart was broken, and he definitely didn't know that Luigi would lose his fucking mind and convince 3 other friends to help him beat the ever-loving shit out of Pepe and then toss his body off the railway bridge. I guess if there's anything those mob movies have taught us is that Italians can keep secrets, because none of those men ever spoke a word of it. Luigi wrote that letter, addressed it, and left it under the care of a law firm with instructions that it should only be mailed in the event of his death. It seems that the guilt caught up with Luigi as he died before he turned 40, and the letter was sent to Mrs. Veraldi. After the shock of this news began to pass, her thoughts drifted back to that crazy day 9 years earlier when Maria Tallarico was momentarily possessed by Pepe. Everything she said checked out. Now it was up to her to find the remaining men and make sure that they got what they deserved. When Mrs. Veraldi presented what amounted to a confession letter to the Catanzaro police, they became very interested in investigating the case. In his letter, Luigi named names. By the way, also taught to us by mafia movies, someone always flips. And the police now had 3 suspects they wanted to talk to about a 12-year-old homicide. The case was officially reopened, and the cops began to quietly track down the men named in the letter. The first one they tried to find had met with the same early death as Luigi, no doubt due to the effects of guilt and shame weighing him down all those years. But the other 2 were alive and well. Before long, the police had them in custody, and they quickly admitted to being involved, apparently relieved to finally clear their conscience. These 2 men were convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Pepe Veraldi's death was finally explained, and his family could embrace that closure and finally mourn and begin to heal with the full knowledge that their son died happy, in love, and tragically too soon. Not the suicide the police rushed to judgment on, but a cowardly act of jealousy, compounded by the fact that the main assailant ran away and evaded justice in his lifetime. But what about Maria Tallarico? Where does her alleged possession fit in? I mean, think about it. If the possession incident hadn't occurred, the outcome of the case would have been the same. Luigi still would have died young, and his confession letter would have been sent to Pepe's mother. Did it help the situation at all? Did it hurt? It's difficult to say, but from a skeptical perspective, it's an interesting question. The investigative processes back in the 30s and 40s wasn't what it is today, or even what it was in the 80s during the Shiva Tripathi case. I bring this up because in a less than robust investigative environment, several doors remain open that would allow for a hoax to slip through. So let's look at the possibilities. One possibility is that, the spirit of Pepe Veraldi took possession of Maria Tallarico for the expressed purpose of letting his mother know that he was murdered. Okay, that's the least likely, while also the most interesting. The next is that it was an elaborate hoax born from the desire to do the right thing when it came to the death of Pepe. One reason for this attack of conscience could be based on religion. Not the fear of a vengeful God for the murderers. There was still time to repent and get into heaven. It was more for the family of Pepe, because if you're Catholic, suicide could be considered a mortal sin and, well, I'll just say you don't get into heaven or purgatory. So let's say one of the bad guys started feeling really terrible about the torment Pepe's mother was going through, thinking incorrectly that her son might be suffering eternal torment in the pits of hell, and decided it was time to do something about it. So he enlisted a local girl that he trusted, gave her all the pertinent facts, while forbidding her from naming names, of course, and set the plan in motion. Maria would only have to keep the act up for a few hours before her dramatic exit, fainting again on the bridge before waking up as if nothing had happened. I mean, that's right out of a daytime soap opera. The people involved in the hoax would have no way of knowing what Luigi had planned to clear his own conscience and relieve the family of their worry for their son's immortal soul years later. But if that's the case, it would require some omerta-level silence from Maria Tallarico. But what it wouldn't require is a suspension of the known laws of physics and the spirit of a murdered young man momentarily inhabiting the body of a young woman to let the people in this plane of existence know that he did not in fact commit suicide, that he was murdered. He would go through all the trouble of crossing over through interdimensional space and time, finding a young girl that he could inhabit and say, "Hey, I was murdered." But I'm not going to tell you the names of the guys who did it. One's definitely more interesting, but one is also definitely more likely. And if Maria Tallarico was able to keep that secret, she was really able to keep the secret and take it all the way to her grave. Thanks for listening. Make sure you're following The Devil Within wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. You could also check out our socials at The Devil Within Pod on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is a Cloud 10 Media production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan. Executive produced by Sim Sarna. Our post-production supervisor is Bruce Whitkin, who also provided original music for this episode. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.